Ooh, hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming again and joining us, Redeeming Life Fellowship, with our daily devotions. And today we're going to be focusing on Psalms, yes, 75 and 76. Psalm 75 and 76. So if you haven't already, go ahead and subscribe to this channel, and then you should hopefully be getting notifications that should help you follow along with us as we're reading through the Psalms together and seeing what part, hearing what God has to say to us through the Psalms. Before we jump into Psalm 75, I wanted to unpack one of the poetic features of the Psalms in general, and this psalm in particular, that I think is going to help us get at what the psalmist is trying to say in this poem. To get at that, I want to discuss or articulate the poetic feature of metaphor. Now, we all deal with metaphors all the time. One of the ones that sticks out in my memory from when I was a child, or, a youth, middle school, when I would play recreational soccer, and it was one of my favorite sports to play, and always play it very aggressively. And I remember at one game, I was playing midfield, and we came in at halftime, and we were all getting drinks of water. And the coach pointed me out and just paused and stopped anything. And he pointed his finger at me and said, you are a beast. And I was like, okay, that's interesting. And when he said that, I'm pretty sure that he knew what he meant, not in the literal sense, a beast, meaning that I'm hairy and smelly and like to bite people, but that rather that the way in which I play is fierce and unafraid of whatever opponents I happen to have, and I'm really good at what I do. But that's the way metaphors work, where there's you offer a picture of something that isn't meant to be literal, but is taken to be real, in the sense that there's overlap between the image that's used and its referent. Now, in Psalm 75, there's at least 3 metaphors that we have to deal with, that if we get a good grasp of what those metaphors are and how they function, they're going to help us with interpreting the psalm and getting at what the psalmist is saying. So what I want you to do is pause here and see if you can identify the 3 metaphors that are used, and go from there. So B, Bryce, Beth Ann, if you're reading, pause, stop, see if you can find 3 metaphors. Ready, go. So, did you find them yet? The first one being pillars, the second one being wine, and the third one being horns. Pillars, wine, and horns. What do these 3 things have in common? Well, they're all found in Psalm 75. So let's unpack what the psalmist means by the pillars. It says, when the earth and all its people quake, it is I who hold its pillars firm. He's not certainly talking about literal pillars, as if these were, stone columns that are somehow holding this earth together. But it's a way of speaking about God's sovereignty, God's power over all creation, that when many other things, most other things, are falling apart, these pillars are the things that's holding the whole thing together. It's interesting enough that when it comes to architecture, ancient architecture that's preserved throughout the millennia, one of the things, the standard features, that when all other things are falling away, pillars end up remaining, and the pillars attached to the foundations of these ancient ruins. The pillars are something that has a way of enduring even when other things are falling apart. And certainly what the psalmist is trying to get at there is that in the moments and times of testing where everything around us is falling apart, that we can trust God to be able to hold things firm. If living in the life of a pandemic has taught us anything, is that there's many things around us, people, institutions, um, preservations, promises of freedom or liberty, things that we were once relied upon, are so subtle or so prone to be shaken that I hope that you, like me, have been encouraged to do as the psalmist says, that is to look to God, who is the one who holds the pillars of the earth firm, so that even in the midst of everything that's shaking, that our hearts will look towards God, and our trust will be found in him. So that's one metaphor. What's the second metaphor? The metaphor of wine, which, as I've been talking to some other people before, wine is a common metaphor that's used throughout the Bible, that's sometimes taken negatively and sometimes taken positively. So in this passage, is it negative or positive? I think it's fairly clear. It is most negative in the way that it's referring to the wine of God's wrath that's being poured out on. It's being poured out upon the wicked of the earth, who drink it down to its very dregs. And that's a challenging image, isn't it? When we think about God pouring out the wine of his wrath, that the wicked are then given to drink, and not just take sips of it, but to intoxicate themselves, as it were, on the punishment of God's wrath that's poured out upon them. What that metaphor helps me to get my mind around is that God is a person who takes wickedness and evil and rebellion against him seriously, because living a life of evil and rebellion against God is one that has consequences. When and how those consequences are meted out, I don't think can be any more clearly articulated than the metaphor of wine being given to drink can be taken literally. But let's read it together. No one from the east or the west or from the desert can exalt a man, but it is God who judges. He brings one down, he exalts another. In the hand of the Lord is a cup full of foaming wine mixed with spices. So it's pretty strong drink, as we can see. He pours it out, and all the wicked of the earth drink it down to its very dregs. It's one image among many that among the Psalms, and indeed among the whole Bible as a whole, that reminds me that God is one who takes evil, injustice, and suffering seriously, and that he's not going to let the wicked go unpunished, but that I can trust God to bring about his justice. And then the third metaphor, one that is very foreign to us, having to do with horns, the horns of all the wicked, or the horns of the righteous. We typically don't refer to people as having horns, his horn, that horn, horn here, horn there, horn everywhere. When the Bible refers to the horns of this person or that person, these are metaphors that are meant to betray the sense of dignity, power, pride, loftiness, strength, that you tend to think of somebody who's exalted. So that if your horns are raised, you're referring to somebody who's not just simply exalted, but as it would be with someone who's proud, someone who exalts themselves, and so that if the horns of the wicked are raised, that's referring to somebody who does think highly of himself and who's become haughty in spirit. If it helps, you can use the language of horns and the image that can come to your mind could be like a charging bull that's ready to pin a matador to the wall, with his mighty horns and that sort of thing. Someone who exalts himself above everybody else. And with that metaphor in mind, what is the Bible saying? I will cut off the horns of all the wicked, but the horns of the righteous will be lifted up. And what's interesting about that is not just simply that the righteous will be exalted, or that the wicked will be humbled, or indeed cut off, but rather it's God's hand that's at work that raises the righteous and lowers the proud. And that's certainly a challenge to me, not least because when I think about somebody who's proud and who's full of themselves, and who is constantly asserting himself and his pride and his prestige over others and putting them down so that he could be higher, I want to be the person who puts that person in their proper place. And when I'm doing that, I'm doing nothing more than just putting myself in the place of the person who, in his pride, wants to put somebody else down. And this is a psalm that invites me to humble myself before the Lord and give God the room and the proper place to be able to exalt the righteous, but humble the wicked. Because it's true that if I'm taking the biblical testimony about the wickedness of the human heart seriously, that the horns of the wicked is talking about me and my own pride and my own selfish heart, and that if I want to be the righteous person that God exalts, I have to allow him to deal with my wicked heart. And that's it's one really, really important aspect to catch out of this psalm. So that's a lot in Psalm 75, isn't it? But let's move on to Psalm 76. And there's a lot that's going on. It's a psalm that its language is full of warfare imagery, which, if you've been following along through the Psalms, you'll find that actually occurs fairly frequently. So it's important for us to get accustomed to that type of language. And the language that's employed here is not just simply one of warfare, but of divine warfare. That is, God waging war against his enemies on behalf of God's people. And there's one key aspect, I think, that well, excuse me, let's pause, read it, and then we'll reflect on it. Ready? Go. So, one of the things that you might have noticed in reading Psalm 76 is that it certainly is a demonstration of God's power as a divine warrior. But notice, what are the effects of God who is accomplishing his purposes as a divine warrior? Let's look at some of these verses. There he broke the flashing arrows, the shields and swords and the weapons of war. Valiant men lie plundered, they sleep their last sleep. Not one of the warriors can lift his hands. At your rebuke, O God of Jacob, both horse and chariot lie still. From heaven you pronounced judgment, and the land feared and was quiet. When you, O God, rose to judge, to save all the afflicted of the land. Surely your wrath against men brings you praise, and the survivors of your wrath are restrained. It's interesting, to my mind, that God, as a warrior, is a God who comes as a deliverer to bring peace. It's a very different thing when there's a man of war who loves war, because it's his own path to power. It's another thing when there's a man who's a man of war, who knows that war is the thing that's necessary to bring a path to peace. And that God, in his divine purposes, is one who will do whatever it takes to be able to bring about peace and an end to war, so that that everyone who's involved in these conflicts that are before us can actually experience shalom, that is peace, which is not just simply like a quiet or a peaceful place, but rather wholeness, deliverance. You could call it even a rightness within the person internally, and a right standing between man and his neighbor. This is one of the Psalms that helps me really gather perspective on not just simply how it is that I understand God's judgment of evil, but also what God's purposes are in being a God of judgment. That God does desire to bring about peace, wholeness, restoration, life to each and every one of us, and that it doesn't happen apart from God's perfect justice, and that he's a God of justice because he's a God of peace, and that those two things are not at odds with one another. And honestly, it's hard to read a psalm like this and not ponder over something that was nothing short of a phenomenon. Perhaps you've heard the story. It was around 1914 in World War I. There were Germans and English Allied forces fighting against one another. And it was on Christmas Eve. At one point, amidst of all the clamor of war, someone began to hear one of the German soldiers singing, Stille Nacht, heilige Nacht. And by catching what he was singing, they could catch the tune that they was singing, Silent Night. And before long, within the same tune, known by both the English and the German, were able to cease fire and join in singing Silent Night, Holy Night, all is calm, all is bright. And the memory was somehow awakened of Christmas and the coming of Jesus Christ, the Prince of Peace. And not only did they cease fire, but were able to come up out of their trenches and begin sharing chocolate and cigarettes with whatever they had with one another. And sadly, it was only by the next day that war resumed and they started killing each other again. It's as though within the horrors of battle, that the vision of God incarnate, who comes to bring peace between the nations, was a glimmer of light that could shine in the middle of of World War I. And what makes it even more ironic is that before we had the designations of World War I and World War II, World War I was to be known as the war to end all wars. Who knows? Maybe it could have been possible that if the light of that truth, that God comes to be able to bring peace and calls people to lay down their arms, that if that sort of thing is taken seriously, that perhaps there would be peace on earth and goodwill towards men. Unfortunately, it didn't. Then we have World War I and World War II and the Cold War, and wars that persist to this day. Uh, but let's reflect on Psalm 76, that when God reigns and our hearts and our eyes are turned towards him, I believe that there will be peace on earth and goodwill towards men, because God is the one who reigns, and who reigns in his justice, and he brings his people peace. And that's the sort of peace that that my heart needs when it's anxious, because I need to learn to yield to the God who reveals himself in Psalm 76. So thank you so much for joining us. It's been a delight. Feel free to leave your comments below. This is all well and good, but I invite you, please come and meet with us on Sundays and Wednesdays so that we can have an even better view of learning how to read and study and grow in God's Word together. That's just the thought of that excites me already. So have a wonderful day. I appreciate you tuning in, and I'll see you next time.